Hey everybody, Andy here, and it's Playpril. That's right, the annual tradition you all totally know about, Plug April, where we all share some of our favorite media and culture with each other. I wanted to start this episode with an earnest, heartfelt plug for the Australian comedy podcast, Bunta Vista. You see, the world is very, very stupid. And as all great art imitates life, Bunta Vista is a very stupid podcast. But the good kind of stupid that makes you feel smart for liking it. I think it's important to be able to laugh at the failures of the great human experiment, like Americans regularly discharging their firearms into their extremities by accident, ships and tractor trailers tipping over and dumping their toxic loads into our groundwater, but sometimes the loads are funny, like marbles or Mountain Dew Code Red or something. The many scams cooked up by sad, desperate people whose only goal in life is to be the exploiter rather than the exploited. And whatever the hell they're doing over there in the Netherlands. For if I did not laugh at these things, I would simply never stop crying. So let these four genuinely kind, quick-witted perverts and sickos be your guides as we use the internet as intended, to look up old bass fishing competition leaderboards and bowling team rosters to laugh at all the silly names in them, but not in a racist way. So listen to Bunta Vista today, anywhere you can get podcasts. Really, it's actually a good show. Should we go then?
Yes.
I hope not too. Welcome to another brand new, shiny episode of Lucky Paper Radio. I'm Andy, and I'm here as always with my co-host, Anthony. He's not stuck in here with me, I'm stuck in here with him, Maddox.
Rude, I think.
It's the first time we've had a non-guest episode in like 2 months.
That is true.
It's been so long.
It's just you and me.
I prefer episodes where it's just you and I, to be honest.
Aw,
you know,
thanks.
I mean, having guests is great and all.
Mm-hmm.
It really wasn't a plan that we ended up with like 7 guest episodes in a row.
No, we just had a lot of great opportunities for great guests.
Yeah, and I'm glad we took those opportunities, and nothing against our guests, but this is the soul of Lucky Paper Radio, in my opinion.
Is it that you really like me, or is it that you like not editing 3+ people?
Can it be both?
It can be both.
It can be both. Editing multiple people is really hard, so if you've been appreciating all that extra effort, maybe go ahead and drop us a 5-star review on iTunes. Give us a nice little rating.
You want to take that again in a different voice?
Nope, that's the voice. That's what we're
okay,
going with.
that's how. Make sure you give your rating in a cool voice too.
That's what we're going with. Actually, we do have exactly 69 reviews right now, so maybe don't give us a rating.
Yeah, I guess.
Well, we got to shoot for 420. That's the next milestone. Got to get to 420 reviews.
Most people hit milestones like 100, 200. No.
Is there another funny number between 69 and 420?
Great question. If you can think of another funny number, let us know.
Ooh, way to drive engagement, Anthony. Leave it in the comments if you can think of
all
another
your
funny
numbers.
That's not 69 or 420. It is in between the two. We are back with a vengeance, though, and this is our March of the Machine. That's how it is? It's singular, right?
March of the Singular Machine.
March of the Singular Machine. This is going to be our mechanics and themes overview episode, and I think we're going to try to squeeze in our Cube editions into this episode, too. You know, usually we do this as 3 separate episodes, and frankly, I think sometimes the first 2 feel a little bit light, a little bit stretched thin. So we'll maybe cover things a little faster than we have in the past, but we're going to touch on all the mechanics of this new upcoming set, what we think of them from a design perspective, absent the context of any specific cubes, and then we're going to talk about the cards that we are including in our own personal cubes, or at least testing in our own personal cubes from this set. And this will be leading up to our community set review, which you have a role in. Right now, our surveys are up for March of the Machine and March of the Machine Commander, so go to luckypaper.co or check the show notes and tell us what you're testing in your cube from this set. Should we address the change in the scoring system briefly?
I think we absolutely should address that. In the past, we've done our rating system on a scale of 1 to 3. That felt a little bit confusing to some people, and had some issues with just things not feeling meaningfully different in sort of the fine grains of like the difference between a 2.1 and a 2.7. So we've updated the rating scale, but to be from 1 to 10, which is maybe a little bit more typical how you've seen rating systems. Everything still applies. Andy added some nice notes to describe as you're inputting what your preferred rating is for each, a sort of descriptive term for what that means. So yeah, I mean, still feel free to use the whole spectrum. Your 1s and 2s are cards that are very speculative. Your 5s are things that, could kind of go either way as far as long-term inclusion in your cube. And your 9s and 10s are cards that are going to be slam dunks. We've also gone back and updated all of the past sets, past surveys to use the same rating scale. So we just adjusted all the scales, so everything should still be nice and consistent.
Yeah, frankly, this is the thing I've been thinking about for a while, mostly because in the perspective articles, it bugs me that I think the ratings are very unintuitive. It's like, this card scored a 2.7. 2.7 is a great score, but it doesn't feel like a great score. Like, what is 2.7? That doesn't feel great. Now that card's going to be like a 9, right? And a 9 out of 10 just feels like a better score. So I think it's going to make the articles more intuitive, and there's also a little more fidelity here in the ratings you can give. So I hope most people are just looking at that slider and kind of like sliding it to a point that feels right and not thinking too hard about the numbers. But if you are thinking really hard about the numbers, that scale is different for you now.
Yeah, so definitely go fill out those surveys. We're really excited to see what everybody thinks about the set. And if you have any questions or feedback or issues, let us know, because, we do all this just because we love interacting with the Cube community.
Who knows why we do all this?
I don't know why we do it. But your feedback is a big part of it. So yeah, definitely hit us up if you have questions, comments, issues, concerns, or if you just like it, I guess.
Yeah, that's good too. Tell us you like it. That feels good.
Yeah.
Let's talk about battles, Anthony.
Okay.
This is the marquee mechanic for March of the Machine. It's the first mechanic mentioned in the new mechanics article that they put out on the mothership every time the new set comes out. Battles is a new card type, and battles are essentially, they kind of behave like enchantments. They are permanents that are on the battlefield, but they are not planeswalkers, they're not artifacts, they're not enchantments either, but they have no like intrinsic attributes, except they can be attacked. They have what amounts to basically a loyalty, and they can be attacked and their loyalty can be reduced to 0, and then something happens. It's a little bit different in a couple of ways. One, when you play a battle, you are not the player that's going to be blocking it as if you were playing your own planeswalker. So you play a battle and you name an opponent to defend it in one-on-one. It's obviously going to be your only opponent. So basically you're setting up a new target for your attacks, and attacking that battle offers you some benefit. In this set, all of the battles are also sieges, and sieges are double-face cards that are battles on the front side, and then when they die, do they have a special term for when the battle is reduced to 0? Its defense counters are reduced to 0? Whenever that happens, the battle is over, I guess, they exile themselves and they become a spell you can put onto the stack. So many of them in this set are creatures that come into play under your control because you're casting that spell off the stack. Some of them are sorceries, and presumably they could be any card type that exists in Magic. So this is a brand new card type. The first time we've gotten a new card type since Sagas, I guess, which came out in Dominaria.
So it's actually the first new card type since Planeswalkers, because Sagas are
right,
just
as a subtype of an enchantment.
Subtype that they added rules baggage to
right,
that
right,
subtype.
Right.
And it is interesting, they've created this new battle card type, and they've also created the siege subtype. So it might not be totally clear right now what is intrinsic to battles and what is part of that siege subtype. And at this point, it doesn't really matter, but just in the future, maybe they'll make battles that you're creating and then you're the one protecting, or maybe both players can attack. Who knows? They could do all kinds of things. And I think a lot of that's going to depend on how well these are received.
These cards are landscape orientation. The first time I've ever seen Magic cards, Black Border Magic cards in landscape orientation. So that's very distinctive, obviously. We just had Sam Black on the show to talk about big and small games, and the first thing I thought when I saw these battles is there could not be a more big game mechanic, in my opinion. This is going to put another permanent into play on the battlefield. That permanent is going to have relevant rules text that has to be paid attention to both you and your opponent. It's going to make decisions for your opponent, unlike some other card types, like, compare this to like Sagas. A Saga doesn't always make new decisions for your opponent. If they don't have a disenchant, the Saga is just going to tick down, it's going to do what it does, and your opponent can't really do anything about it. Now you're giving your opponent the option to defend or not defend this battle. They should know what's going to happen when the battle is defeated and the backside and what that card does.
Right, because just like a Planeswalker, you attack the battle and they can choose which creatures, if any, they want to block with. So it's just another thing that they're defending with, whatever the resources are.
So, new permanent on the battlefield, it's some kind of card advantage, I guess, if you think about it being defeated and you're getting another card out of it. And more importantly, I think for the big game aspect, it is another thing to be attacked, which is going to effectively gain your opponent life, because if you're attacking the battle, you're gaining your opponent life, which is going to prolong the game and allow more spells to be cast. So I've definitely looked at all of these through the lens of which of these effects are good in big games, because I expect these cards to lead to big games and be most effective in big games.
Interesting. Is that really what's relevant, though? Because I feel like you could also play a card that is I mean, I think a lot of these are just like reasonable standalone effects. A lot of these are even literally just cards we've seen before tacked onto a battle. It's, enters the battlefield, scry 2, draw a card, or, make some tokens. So I feel like they can just be cards that function in the same way as cards that we've seen in all kinds of games in the past.
I mean, if you're ignoring the battle part entirely, then you're kind of like, sure, yes, I guess.
Yep.
That's like saying, well, this creature is inherently a big game card because I could just simply not attack with it, and then all I get is enter the battlefield ability.
You could, yeah. It makes sense to me.
Anyway, I think they're very big game cards, so I think people that are really into complex board states, like those kind of big puzzle-solving board states, are going to be drawn to this kind of card type. For me, maybe people can predict based on my affinity for small games and my avoidance of unnecessary complexity. I'm not testing any of these out of the gate. And maybe if we fast forward, 18 months, 2 years down the line, there's way more battles and everyone knows what battles are and understands how they work, and it's much more understood by the average Magic player, and it feels like less of a hurdle, and then maybe I come back and look at some of these cards once that has happened. But for now, this feels so new, so novel, and it feels like it's pushing so much in a direction that I'm not interested in for my own cube, that it's not a mechanic I am going to be testing.
Sure. I would definitely, if I would roll that back a little bit to what your point was, when I'm talking specifically about cards that I might include in my cube, I definitely want them to be relevant as battles if I'm going to include them. I don't want to put it in there if it's just like, yeah, you like the front half of this, this effect will be relevant, but there's no reason to ever attack this, right? So because as a designer, I would want both halves to be relevant, it's definitely going to only makes sense in games where like tempo is not the main focus, because you are just gaining your opponent a bunch of life by choosing not to attack them for a couple turns. And I agree that in most of my cubes, having these effects that are just saying like, yeah, you don't care about tempo, all you want to do is just be engaging in the side quest from the get-go and generate these other resources, is probably not the game that I think interests me. But I'm definitely going to have to change, or I'm going to think about this once I actually play these cards, because it's really difficult for me to evaluate how much that sort of, I'm going to pause this game and go on a side quest instead is going to be fun or not for me.
Yeah, I'm really excited to play with them at pre-release. We're recording this before pre-release. We haven't actually cast any of these cards yet. I think on power level, it's really hard to evaluate these. The front half of all of them, I think we can safely say, is pretty overcosted, right? Like if you never attack the battle and you never flip it, you're looking at paying more for the effect of that battle entering the battlefield. I think they all have enter the battlefield abilities, right? I mean, like, theoretically, they could
right, so you always
have
get
a static
some effect.
Theoretically, they could have a static ability, like, they come into play in your opponent's control. So the static would be like, whenever a player attacks you, you lose a life or something.
I mean, so this is where the rules complexity really gets there with these cards, is I think they still are under your control, but under your opponent's defense.
Yikes.
Mm-hmm.
Well, anyway, they all have enter the battlefield abilities. So if you are looking at them just as spells, right? I cast as I get the enter the battlefield ability. I don't think you're going to be drawn to any of these cards because they are not doing anything particularly mechanically unique in most instances, and it's, in most cases, more mana than you expect to pay for that effect on average. And then I have no idea how to rate on power level the backside of these cards, right? Like, part of me says, like, well, in an aggressive deck, I'll be able to very reliably flip my battle. And then I'm like, why would I not want to be attacking my opponent's life total in my aggressive deck? Like, if I'm trying to win with tempo, why am I going for this value play of, like, getting a 2-for-1 or whatever?
Well, you just want to go grind, do all the side quests, over-level your character, get all the equipments, and then you can just go beat the end really easily.
This is like playing an RPG and just,
exactly.
You're in Pokemon, you're just grinding in those grassy fields until you get to that first gym and all of your creatures are enormous. I'm very interested to see where this mechanic goes, and honestly, I'm kind of surprised that the first implementation of battles we see is a subtype of battles that are all sieges. That feels like maybe a more complicated implementation of this. Like, I can imagine a much more simple kind of battle, which is just a thing that can be attacked. When it goes away, something good happens for you. And it can be much simpler, so it all fits on the front. There's no, like, spell that goes in the stack. And we should say that you do exile a thing and then put the spell in the stack, so you can counter the battle, the backside of the battle when it comes back down if you want. So there's that little, like, weird edge there if you want to counter the battle after your opponent's wasted attack steps attacking it. So yeah, I'm really curious to see where this goes, but for now, I'm going to watch from the sidelines when it comes to my own cubes.
Yeah, I would say if before hearing about these battles, if you asked me what do you want for your cube, I wouldn't have said another new double face card type with lots of complexity and a bunch more text in the back. That is not what I would have said. So yeah, I mean, I'm definitely interested in playing them at the pre-release, but it's just not something that I'm like looking for in a way, if that's okay to say.
I was thinking about how much I think the Overton window has moved on Magic card complexity. For those that don't know this concept, the Overton window refers to the kinds of political ideas that are accepted to be discussed in public, right? So, for example, we might see mass media discussing things like nationalized healthcare on the left, but we rarely see them discussing things like abolishing the Supreme Court or something that falls too radical, too far outside of that window to be discussed. And you can talk about the same thing on the right. And that window moves basically as things happen in our culture and society. And one of the big things with, Trump or whatever was that he moved the Overton window on a lot of right ideas because he was so extreme in so many ways. It was like, well, now somebody else who otherwise would have been an insane reactionary just looks moderate compared to that. So anyway, I was thinking about the Overton window concept with regards to these because I genuinely had the thought like, man, Fable the Mirror Breaker, that's a complex card for me. Like that makes so much more sense to me and feels so much more appropriate than these battles in like my cube environments. And if you rewind to when Fable was printed, I was like, this card's crazy complex. But that window is just moved. Like, I think by printing cards that are as complex as we've gotten in recent years, my tolerance for things has gone up quite a bit. And maybe that'll continue. Maybe, again, fast forward 2 years, I'm all about battles. We'll see. It could happen, but not there yet.
I mean, it is a lot of complexity, and it is definitely something that you can explain how a battle works to me, and I get it. That's not a problem. But when you put this in a pack of 14 other cards that also have that same level of complexity, it is getting to be a lot. And we have seen almost every set recently, I think, mechanics that you just cannot read the card and understand what's happening. Like, you need to understand the rules baggage behind it, which is great in limited, but for a lot of the cube environments I'm curating is not something I'm interested in putting all of those together all at once. I also just ran the numbers. This is a little bit incidental, but while we're talking about complexity, on the average words per card in all these sets, and in March of the Machine, it's almost 45 words per card, which is a huge jump up from like the 38 per card that we were seeing in recent sets. Here's a cool graph that you can't see, but maybe I'll tweet about it.
That is a graph.
So yeah, I mean, just in a very literal sense, there is a lot of complexity in this set, and I think battles contributed to that in a big way.
And before you leave a comment or write an email, I know number of words does not directly correlate to actual complexity. There's all different kinds of complexity, but it's certainly a factor, and it is one kind of complexity.
Yeah.
So I'm going to also shout out, we put a video on our YouTube channel that Anthony helped me produce of me getting a coaching session from Brian Koval of the Boschenroll YouTube channel of me playing a match with decks drafted from my cube. So it's a 2-hour video of me playing a match with my cube and Brian talking through the replay with me and explaining all the things I did wrong. And in the first game, small spoiler alert for this video if you want to watch it, I guess. In the first game, like the second or third decision I made was on a board where my opponent had exactly one creature. I had only 2 spells I could cast that were the exact same mana value, and I basically chose the wrong one for like nuanced reasons. And I was thinking about how that decision is difficult, right? I've gotten multiple people that have written me or tweeted me and said, like, I would have done that too, and it was so cool to see the explanation for why that was actually the wrong line. And Magic is so complicated, even in situations like that. Even when there's one creature in play and you only have 2 spells you can cast, that is already a situation where there's a lot of complex decisions to be made. And so what I'm looking for in Magic is not more complexity, right? And I totally get people that are, right? Like, I think some people just want it to be as complicated and puzzly as possible, but I'm really trying to get those decisions right? And I want the room to focus on those decisions and not be overwhelmed by all the different options that cards are presenting with me. At least that's where I'm at right now in my journey with Magic.
Yeah, I think I'm in a very similar place. And we play a fair amount of Magic, and it's still a lot.
It's Andy from the future. When we recorded this episode, we had not yet played with any of these cards. It was before pre-release, but since then, we have been in pre-release and we have played with battles, and I just wanted to interject one particular play pattern I think is kind of important about battles that we didn't address here, which is that I think on their face, some people might see battles and think they are going to encourage attacking because they provide a benefit when they are defeated. But I think somewhat counterintuitively, maybe they actually discourage attacking because if you know your opponent has battles in their deck, you can't always afford to engage in what would otherwise be a race. For example, let's say you have assessed the board, you think it's a race, and you are using your life total as a resource, and you're fine taking 4 or 5 damage from your opponent's attacks as long as you're getting it for damage as well. That might not be true of a battle taking 4 or 5 damage. You might not be willing to give them the backside of a battle, and so it kind of almost makes it feel like your opponent's creatures have haste to some degree if they have battles in their deck. Because when you attack, you're making the gamble that you are not going to need those blockers for a battle you don't yet know about. So overall, I do think they contribute to really big board states like we talked about in the episode, and also introduce some new strategic complexity in addition to their mechanical complexity. Back to the show. Hey, Anthony, guess what?
What?
The next mechanic is transforming double-face cards.
Double-face cards. Excellent. Tell me more.
Would you call this a cycle? There's a bunch of cards in this set that are double-faced cards that you basically pay some cost to flip to the other side. So I think they're all creatures on the front side, and they flip into various things. The most notable ones of this cycle are, there's one card for each of the Phyrexian Praetors, and they flip into a saga, and then after the saga resolves, if it resolves, they flip back into the creatures. So you can do this sort of back and forth thing. Talk about cards that are hard to evaluate. They do a lot, they're powerful, they're a lot of mana, and it's hard for me to evaluate exactly how powerful these things are. That's a mechanic here. We also see some other cards that are just creatures that flip into creatures. I think one of the cards that a lot of people will be excited about, and I'm kind of interested in, is like Kenra Spellspear, for example. This is a 2-mana creature with prowess and trample, and you can pay 3 and a blue Phyrexian mana, so 3 and 2 life, or 3 and a blue, to flip it into a 3/3 creature with ward 2, trample, prowess, so double prowess. So it just flips into a much, much, much better version of itself if you can find 4 mana at some point to flip it. You'd activate that as a sorcery for what it's worth. So there's also cards like that in here.
Yeah, I mean, as far as double-face cards, we've talked about, modal double-face cards versus transforming double-face cards, and I definitely like these a lot more. It's very much okay, on the front, I'm getting a 2-mana 2/2 prowess, I know how to evaluate that. Plus, it's almost like Kicker in the sense that I have this extra ability that's maybe relevant late in the game, but you get to do it, depending on when it's relevant and across multiple turns.
It reminds me a lot of the level-up creatures and the, faux level-up creatures in, the form of Warden of the First Tree and Figure of Destiny and whatnot. But actually, I think much better, much easier to understand, because those cards actually very often don't have a great way to represent their state.
Yeah, I mean, in that logistical sense, double-face cards do have that advantage that once they're in play and you flip them, it's very clear what the state of these cards is. But the logistics of using them in a draft for Cube, that still is also a pretty big negative, so it's kind of up to every player in Cube Designer to evaluate if that is worth it to them.
Some of these also have conditions, so for example, like the red Praetor Urabrask, its condition to flip it to its saga side is pay a red and also have cast 3 or more instant or sorcery spells this turn. And then you can flip it into a really extremely powerful saga. The payoff is enormous if you get to do that. So there's all kinds of ways they're playing with this. But overall, again, I think in terms of double-faced card mechanics, this is definitely one of my favorite ways to do it because it's very clear to understand what's going on, and then, it just essentially levels up, which is a thing we see on many other cards, but it does it in a way that is actually easier to read, I think.
Yeah, and it's also, I think, one of the biggest issues with modal double-face cards is that it's really hard to evaluate without understanding both halves, because you always have the potential to cast both sides from your hand.
Yeah.
These are always just, it's a 2-mana 2/2 prowess, do I like that baseline, and I know it is a bonus. It's something else I can do that is just going to make this card more powerful, which just makes, I think, these cards a lot easier to understand and evaluate how you're going to play them as a player, opening them up in a draft pack.
Small note here of a thing that irks me a little bit. A lot of these cards have off-color Phyrexian mana in their cost to flip them, and just visually, I have found that a lot of players, even though Phyrexian mana can be paid with life, I found that players that aren't blue just don't take Cataxium Probe or, whatever. I think visually, for example, this Spellspear looks like a blue-red card. When you flip it on the backside, it's literally a gold card, but you need no blue mana in your deck to actually play this card, right? You just cast it for 2 red, flip it for 3 generic and 2 life. So there's that little aesthetic thing of it looking like it's a gold card. I could see somebody playing red-black being well, I can't flip it, so that's no good for me. When in actuality, you totally can. So one thing to note there.
Yeah, that is a little bit weird. I don't totally get that. Just why they've chosen to give it a Phyrexian off color in, I think, every case here.
Yeah, I'm not sure why either. I mean, I don't know. I think the next mechanic is really cool. It's backup. Backup is an ability that's found on creatures. It's always followed by a number, so backup 1, backup 2, etc. And it says whenever that creature enters the battlefield, you put that many +1/+1 counters on target creature, and if you choose another creature as the target, that creature gets every ability of the original creature, the one with backup, that is printed below the backup part until the end of the turn. This is actually, I think, a really elegant, cool mechanic. Basically, you have a creature, let's imagine it has, double strike or something. You cast it, it has backup. You can either put a +1/+1 counter on your double strike creature and just get, a bigger double striker, or you put that counter somewhere else, and that creature gains double strike until end of turn. I think this is a really cool take. It's like a weird meld between Soulbond almost and Riot, or almost kind of like Dash in some ways. It's less like Dash, but the idea that you can have extra power and toughness with haste with extra abilities kind of out of nowhere is kind of cool. We've talked at length about how interesting +1/+1 counters are because of the different value based on where you put them. I think the question of where you put a +1/+1 counter is a really simple but deep one. And in the case of backup, the idea of being able to pass around different abilities to other cards also opens up a lot of possibility for cool interactions, right? Giving something double strike can really change what a card does. Giving something flying can really change what a card does. So I think it's really awesome. And the other thing that's great about it is you have that +1/+1 counter as an indicator of where you put those abilities, and you only have to remember till the end of turn. So it's not like you're creating these weird memory issues or making something that's hard to track. It's like a one-time enter the battlefield ability. And I think it's going to be really popular in a lot of cubes because a lot of cubes love +1/+1 counters. This plays naturally with that long-standing evergreen mechanic and has all those other pluses I talked about.
Totally. I think this is a really awesome mechanic, and what I love about it is sort of the ratio of how much actual complexity there is to read and understand these cards versus the interesting strategic complexity of how they're going to play out. And like you're talking
mechanical
about
simplicity but strategic complexity.
Exactly. Like that's where I get really excited about card designs and mechanic designs. And yeah, just that decision of where do I want to put this counter? Am I going to combine this counter with other keywords to, make double strike really relevant? Do I care about some of this power having haste effectively by being able to throw it to another creature? And then just combining these effects in neat ways. And I do actually love that this is sort of a one-shot mechanic. It's not a huge snowballing creature that's going to be doing this thing every turn. It's not, the logistical complexity and memory issues of something like Soulbond. It's just, here's my effect that I'm using. I'm putting this counter here. I get this one turn shot. And, that also just means that turns will play out different from turn to turn, which I really enjoy that about games versus, oh yeah, these have flying now forever, and now you just we're in a place where you can't attack well, or, states that can sort of be more consistent are often less fun. So I'm a huge fan of this.
Yeah, I think it's a great mechanic. And there is plenty of cards in Magic's history that effectively behave very similarly, even though they don't have this named mechanic.
Sure.
Creatures that enter the battlefield and have first strike and give first strike to something else temporarily to end of turn. But I think the whole package is really elegant and nice. And it's really nice that they have the floor of just playing a bigger creature, right? Like getting the thing with the abilities and having another +1/+1 counter on it. And then the ceiling is going to be really high because sometimes that +1/+1 counter and the temporary moving of those abilities is going to make a huge difference. So great mechanic. A++.
Thumbs up. Great job.
On to Incubate. Incubate is another mechanic that is followed by a number, so Incubate 1, Incubate 2, Incubate 3. And what that means is you create a incubator token with n number of +1/+1 counters on it, whatever that number is, and it also has the ability, pay 2, transform this artifact. It transforms into a 0/0 Phyrexian artifact creature. So it starts out as just, the incubator is not a creature, right? That's just an artifact token.
Yeah, it's just a token artifact incubator.
That's just an artifact token that has +1/+1 counters on it, but those counters do nothing effectively because it's not a creature, and then you can basically pay some mana to flip it into a creature, and you can do that at instant speed, which is kind of interesting. So it's basically a token-making mechanic with the extra caveat that you have to pay to essentially activate these tokens, which I think means, from a balance perspective, they can maybe push the power level of some of these incubate effects, where if it was just making a creature automatically, that might be problematic, especially things that can make many over time, because if you make a bunch of 1/1s with Incubate, having to pay 2 every single time to flip them is going to be a huge cost. So I think it's interesting that it lets them make maybe more aggressive token-making payoffs because you have to pay a little bit to activate those tokens.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a pretty simple mechanic, all things considered, in that it is just making these sort of tokens that have a layaway cost of 2. You have to pay 2 before you actually get the creature of whatever size, and it's flexible in that they can make any combination in sizes of these creatures. Like you mentioned, that does give them a lot of flexibility in the way that they're balancing things, because it does have some cost, which means you can also just make cards that do stuff with these artifact tokens. Maybe it just cares about having artifacts in general, or
right, I was going to say,
artifacts.
We've talked about the value of just making an artifact token that does nothing, right? If this is something you can tap if you have a thing that makes your artifacts tap for mana, or if you have things that have improvise, or a million other mechanics that just care about you having artifacts in play. And
absolutely.
Then they're relatively safe from removal. I mean, at least creature removal. They can still get hit by artifact removal.
And then they also interact with anything that cares about +1/+1 counters. So there's just a lot of mechanical space for these to interact with stuff. I think my favorite part about this, though, is just the sort of flavor of it. The fact that you have this sort of sense of the Phyrexians are here and they're starting to grow their army, and there's this really spooky flavor of they're just setting up all these pods.
Look at all them eggs!
Grow these Phyrexians, and just imagining, I'm fighting my opponent, but they've built up this huge squadron of pods that are about to hatch. I think it's just a very cool flavor, and I'm excited to see how that pans out as well.
I think people are going to underestimate the power level of these initially because they're going to see that additional cost and be like, oh, these are worse than making creature tokens. It seems like a downside. But I've been playing the Neoclassical Cube a bit, and I've been playing a card called Chimeric Idol in there, which I think people don't know about, but it's a 3-mana artifact that has an activated ability. You can pay 0 and tap all your lands to make it a 3/3 creature till end of turn, which is a weird ability. But I think the threat of activation on these is going to be huge. The idea that you can make a Incubate token and then pass the turn, hold up mana, hold up interaction, your opponent can't swing into an Incubate token that, if turned into a creature, would just eat their creature, right? That is not an attack they can make without some trick up their sleeve, realistically, because they just give you the option to eat their creature for 2 mana.
And if you know that they know that you know, then... Okay.
Yeah, game theory. But then you get all the benefit of having this thing that is somewhat protected, right? Like not being able to have your thing lightning bolted or Doombladed or whatever is a big value. So you get to kind of build up this army that has this threat of activation value, but is also safe from some removal. You can cast board wipes with all your Incubate tokens in play if they're not flipped. You could just kind of go nuts with these things, which I think is really powerful. So I think this is a really cool mechanic, and I'm excited to play with it in pre-release.
Yeah, and to go with this mechanic, there are a bunch of cards that care about Incubate tokens or will flip your Incubate tokens. So you definitely could, in a cube environment, go really deep and include some of those cards and make that whole thing a theme. But a lot of the one-off cards that just create Incubate tokens are also just going to be reasonable cards that you can put into a lot of different contexts without any specific support.
Another great mechanic, I think. I mean, the fact that it touches +1/+1 counters, it cares about artifacts, it has this cool board presence and threat of activation. And I'll say, yeah, that's also a big board thing, right? Like having all these things in play is a big game thing, but it's a big game kind of thing that I like more than complicated permanents that are hard to parse from across the table.
Right.
This is pretty clear. They'll see the dice on it. They'll know 2 mana that turns into a creature of that size.
It does make more double face cards, but I feel like, again, this is a case where
tokens, it's fine.
The double face-ness is going to communicate really well what the state is. It is just a token, so hopefully you'll actually have the tokens with you, or you'll draw some nice pictures on your infinite tokens, or what have you. Yeah, I mean, for me, the flavor really does just make it feel a lot simpler.
The flavor is the one thing that I think makes this not as like backwards compatible. It's just going to feel kind of weird. Like all the
Phyrexian egg here with all my...
I think all of the things that Incubate feel very Phyrexian and feel very specific, and
which I think is good in the context of the set,
for sure.
Very intentional.
Oh, absolutely. But I can also imagine this being like a fantastic evergreen mechanic, but this is not going to be an evergreen mechanic because it's very Phyrexian. So we're not going to see this in non-Phyrexian sets, I can't imagine, because it is so tied to that flavor and lore.
Sure.
They didn't mention it in this article, Anthony, but there's a lot of cards with Convoke in this set, so I think it bears discussion.
Yeah, Convoke is a cool mechanic. It says that you can have your creatures help you cast a spell, and you can tap any number of your creatures to contribute either 1 generic mana or a mana of the color of that creature's colors to pay for 1 mana towards a spell, which is previously a mechanic that we've seen specifically associated with the Selesnya Guild in a lot of Guilds of Ravnica sets. Now we're seeing it a lot, especially in blue and red, associated with a lot of cards that make a bunch of tokens and then cast some big splashy Convoke spell.
I feel like I might just talk about things so much in the context of big and small games, but again, a great big game mechanic.
I hope you listen already for the next 2 months of
the
just
new
talking
chapter,
about
the
big
new chapter.
and small games.
We can mark the
long tail is in the dust.
It's gone. But yeah, this is a great big game mechanic. This is something that's fantastic when you have a lot of creatures in play, your opponent has a lot of creatures in play, and you get to use them to get discounts on these spells and play them at bigger costs than you otherwise would be able to afford. One of the classics, and I'm glad to see it back in force.
I like that it does encourage sort of thinking about your board state in a different way, thinking about the creatures you have in play as a resource, which maybe motivates just games to play out differently because you don't want to trade off resources necessarily because you have a spell your opponent doesn't know about. I also like that it encourages drafting around them in a specific way and trying to build towards having decks that can really take advantage of them and generate a lot of creatures in order to, just have that resource to make these cards work. And I like making tokens anyway, so it kind of just works.
You do love your tokens. See, you love big games. You like tokens.
Yeah.
I know you've done your classic deep dive of unnamed themes and mechanics in this set. Let's do a little lightning round of other stuff that we see popping up on a lot of cards in this set.
So the biggest one I see a bunch of is just +1/+1 counters. Obviously, Incubate and Backup both interact with +1/+1 counters, so if you have any kind of environment that cares about them, there's going to be a lot to work with here. And like we said, a +1/+1 counter is just a thing with value in itself, so it makes sense really in any set, but there's a lot here if you want to specifically lean into that. Similarly, there's a fair amount of artifact stuff. There isn't a lot of colorless stuff, but there are a bunch of obviously the Incubate tokens, which are artifacts, and often just, cards make incidental artifacts, which might be relevant. There's also a fair amount of colored artifacts in terms of equipment and things like that. So we've been seeing through the last, it feels like 4 sets, maybe more than that, just a ton of artifact themes, and they're just
specifically colored artifacts. We've seen
and that
really
as well.
Spiking.
We also have sort of the general smattering of sort of the usual suspects of the color pie. There's a lot of spells matter stuff, again, along with Convoke in blue and red. There's a lot of sacrifice themes and some mill themes in blue and black. So if you're interested in those kinds of things, there's going to be a lot to be able to discover there. The other two sort of louder mechanics that I think are worth mentioning are Phyrexian Tribal and Night Tribal. We see in every set there's a little bit of tribal here or there, just in, maybe 1 or 2 colors to sort of spice things up, because it gives you sort of a different axis to care about things.
It's also just very flavorful.
And it's very flavorful.
I have built those starter decks that I've talked about before, and so many of them, they just ended up being tribal because it makes so many things more resonant and obvious that otherwise would require a level of thinking. Like, tribal is just so intuitive to people.
And I think these two in particular are really interesting. We see lots of elves and goblins and zombies, the classic big tribes. Knights have sort of been on the periphery for a long time, but we don't necessarily see a lot of consistent support for them. And in this set, they're specifically in blue and white, which is a little bit novel. So
yeah,
it's
that's
cool
the
to
unique
see that.
thing here, I think, is the blue and white knight support as opposed to black and white.
Yep. So there's a lot of a couple more new sort of payoffs for Night Tribal, which are worth exploring. And then Phyrexian Tribal is obviously huge because until recently, Phyrexian wasn't even a creature type because maybe it just didn't fit on cards, or, the Phyrexians being creatures that would complete other creatures. Maybe I think in early Magic it felt weird to actually give them a creature type, but they since a couple sets back when Vorinclex first showed up, they've actually errated a bunch of old cards to be Phyrexians, and with that, they finally enabled actually creating, things that care about Phyrexians. And we haven't really seen that until this set, and now it's coming out in force. So there are a ton of cards that care about Phyrexians. So if that's a tribe that appeals to you, now is your chance. Now you have the tools to go and build a Phyrexian tribal theme in your own cube.
Anything else they didn't mention by name?
You know what else surprised me a little bit was basic land cycling. There were a couple, more than a cycle of just basic land cycling cards. We've been playing those a fair amount in your Neoclassical cube, as well as they show up in my Turbo cube, which is, I don't know why I'm bringing that up, but basic land cycling is a pretty cool mechanic.
Rule number 1, we don't talk about the
Turbo Cube. We'll talk about the Turbo Cube
Rule number 2,
in a minute here.
You always Turbo Cube if it's your first night.
Okay, I get it. Yep.
Rule 2 of Fight Club is you fight if it's your first time.
It's been a long time since I've seen Fight Club.
Yeah,
so basic land cycling is back. These are cards that you can discard to go get a land of the specified type from your deck, and this doesn't come up in a lot of really high-powered cubes because often it does cost 2 mana, which is a big cost.
I think always it costs 2 mana. I don't think I've ever seen a typed basic land cycling. Like, you're saying basic land cycling, you're talking about mountain cycling, forest cycling.
Correct, yeah.
There is not basic land cycling in this set.
Correct.
Yeah.
But the advantage is you get this interesting modality of, here's a big expensive creature that I'm probably not going to cast most of the time. Most of the time I'm just going to go get land. But
I like how you say most of the time you're going to cycle that, but you always cast Shark Typhoon.
Yes.
You're a complicated man that contains multitudes.
I don't think that's different.
Yeah, it's different because cycling Shark Typhoon is better because it gives you a creature every time.
Casting Shark Typhoon is cool. Casting your 6 mana 4/4.
These do nothing to affect the board when you cycle them, and when you play them, you do affect the board. Shark Typhoon, when you cycle it, affects the board and does nothing when you cast it until you do something else.
Which I'm going to do
basically,
next turn.
You just don't like affecting the board.
Give me another turn.
You're allergic to affecting the board with your big cycling cards.
I just want to dream bigger.
This is a great transition into the cards I'm testing in the Neoclassical Cube, Anthony, because I'm testing 2 cards. It is 2 of the basic land cyclers. It's Furnace Host Charger, which is 5 and a red for a 5/5 red creature with haste, and it has mountain cycling too, and Timberland Ancient, which is 4 green for a 6/5 reach trample with forest cycling too.
Do you want to give a little bit of context on the environment?
Yeah, this is my old border inspired cube, so it's all about old school Magic, but I don't actually restrict the cards played to only old school cards. I just want to make sure that if I'm playing cards that are modern border, they feel appropriate to me. They feel like they could have been printed in old border, or they really enhance a theme that is present already in old border Magic. And there are definitely lots of cycling creatures in old border Magic. I'm playing some of them now, and these are just upgrades in terms of power level. Because right now I'm playing cards like Chartooth Cougar and Noble Templar, which are very similar to these cards, but just way worse when you cast them because they were designed in the olden days when that's how creatures were. And I think these are very similar in terms of their play patterns, but I actually played a cycling deck in the Neoclassical Cube last night and really felt that the casting side of those just couldn't hang with the power level of the cube. So these actually seem like they could actually hang a little better. So I'm excited about these 2. The other ones in this cycle reference things I don't want to use in the old border cube, like new mechanics or new card types and stuff. So these are the ones that actually fit, and I think they're going to be good fits.
Neat.
That's all I'm testing for the Neoclassical cube, and I don't expect to mention this cube very often during our set reviews because, most of the cards for it have already been printed 20 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, you can pretty easily, I think, look at this set, and in your Scryfall search, just do a, minus backup, minus incubate, minus battle, and you narrow it down to very few cards that are actually going to be relevant for this particular context.
What I actually did was cycling, and that was how I looked at cards for this one.
Perfect. Should we talk about the regular cube?
Yeah.
So this is my primary cube, which I think the easiest comparison point is to something like a master set in terms of power level and play patterns. It's very much about...
Anthony Maddox remastered.
Exactly. Play into the board and about getting the most value out of your cards. There aren't a lot of huge bombs or things that don't at least take some investment to generate a lot of card advantage and value. Like we talked about, backup is a clear, I think, slam dunk for this environment because it does all that stuff. There's a lot of little things that can key off of other cards. There's a lot of, mixing the +1/+1 counters with keywords or granting temporary abilities to shift combat in subtle ways.
That's kind of already a theme of your cube almost, it feels like.
Absolutely, yeah.
In the Naya colors, it feels like +1/+1 counters, or specifically this small creature has a lot of good abilities and wants you to make it bigger in some way, be that counters or an aura or a combat trick.
Yeah, so I think this is a really, really great fit. There are 4 in particular that I think I'm going to test. Enduring Bond Warden, which is a white mana for an 0/1 with backup 1, and whenever this creature dies, put its counters on target creature you control. This is obviously very cool because if you have something that already has a bunch of counters, you can put another counter on it, and then threaten to trade in combat. And then if your opponent trades with it, you still get to move those counters. So it gives you that interesting, one-shot effect of making something difficult to block. Plus, on its own, it's just a 1-mana 1/2, which is going to block the many saplings and squirrels floating around that can then move its one counter when it dies. So there is just, a lot of flexibility in all of those things we're just talking about. Chomping Kavu is the next one. This is 4 mana for a 3/3 with backup 1. So at its floor, it's just a 4 mana 4/4, which is kind of where I'm at in green. A 4 mana 4/4 with a little bit extra is a pretty reasonable card, I think, here. It also has, this creature can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less, which again, with backup, you can grant to one other creature for 1 turn. And that's honestly just one of my favorite kinds of evasion. I wish they would just give that a keyword because it's a lot of words to explain.
Unchumpable.
Unchumpable. That's exactly what it is, which is, again, pretty relevant in this environment because I'm a little token happy.
Mm-hmm.
Scornblade Berserker is the next one. This is black for an 0/1 with backup 1, and it has sacrifice this creature, draw a card, which is very different from the other 2 effects because this is not
no
as much
mana
relevant.
On that, right? You just
costs one mana to sacrifice it. So what this can be is you pay black and then 2 generic, sacrifice 2 creatures, draw 2 cards, which is kind of interesting. That's kind of a bad card, but having that flexibility of everything in between, I think is just pretty interesting flexibility.
Tends to be a kind of card type you like. You have a fair bit of sacrifice a thing to draw cards in this cube.
Yeah, that's maybe a little bit of the risk is I might just be pushing a little bit too hard on that theme. So this one I'm less confident in than the previous 2, but still I think it's maybe worth some consideration. The next one I think is kind of cool is Hanger Scrounger. This is 2 and a red for a 2/1. It's got backup 1, and whenever this creature becomes tapped, you may discard a card and draw a card. This is kind of an interesting twist on a looting effect that, you can throw that counter. Rummaging, thank you. Throw that counter to another creature, attack, again, giving effectively one of its power haste and then giving you a rummage right away, plus has a lot of late game potential if you can have this guy crew vehicles or if you can still get through an attack with it, or maybe you just attack because you need to get some rummaging to find your out in a particular game. So I think there is a lot of interesting play from a otherwise pretty simple card here.
All great fits for the regular cube, I think.
So regular. The next chunk of cards I'm curious about are basically just a bunch of Convoke cards. What do you think overall about Convoke in this environment? A little bit of hesitation is there are fairly wide board states sometimes in this environment, so, and frankly, a lot of the Convoke cards in this set I think are pretty pushed. It's not a 5 mana removal spell, it's a 2 or 3 mana removal spell with Convoke, so my skepticism comes from the fact that these might just be free cards in a lot of contexts and a lot of game states, which is not necessarily something that feels as appropriate.
Well, I think if the board state is big and you can make these cards really good, my hope would be that it would break any kind of board stall.
Sure.
And so I would maybe hew towards ones that made the board smaller or offered a big advantage to you as opposed to ones that just continued to make the board bigger and more cloggy. I'm not sure if any of those exist. Yeah, that's maybe the only thing I would say about it. I think Convoke is a fine fit here. I think in the grand scheme of things, as your goal insists, the regular cube is kind of right down the middle in terms of how big the board states are.
Everything's going to be a C-.
Like if you look at something like the Live the Dream cube or, many multiplayer cubes or something, like those are big boards.
Yeah.
Even like the Brea cube, I find oftentimes has really big
yeah.
board states because that cube designer just likes puzzly board states, and so they end up being pretty big. I think the regular cube is somewhere in the middle. It depends on the matchup. Sometimes you can end up in a matchup where it's like blue-green versus blue-green, and nobody's got removal, and they're just kind of staring each other down because...
it's rare to have a single blue-green player in this cube. 2 is kind of a
I'm trying to
dream.
think. I've seen a couple of matches where it's just like, wow, that one's going to go on forever.
It's like the green-white matchups where both players are going wide at exactly the same speed. Or
yeah,
the
green-white's
green-black.
another good example. You have some removal in white, but not an abundance of removal. Really, red and black are your removal colors, I feel like. So
yeah.
It can happen. You can definitely get matchups in that cube that are really big, and if Convoke is a way to help break those stalls, then I'm into it.
Okay, so I'm feeling pretty good about these then. First up, I've got Collective Nightmare, 2 and a black for an instant with Convoke. Target creature gets -3/-3 until end of turn. I feel like this might be an easy swap for some of the removal spells I have currently. Similarly, Pile On is 3 and a black for an instant, again with Convoke. Destroy target creature or Planeswalker, Surveil 2. So, this is just the classic big and small removal that we have in a lot of limited sets. I guess not quite because the second one's a rare. Yeah, I think that these will be pretty reasonable fits, aside from that concern of if free spells feel a little bit weird here. And, it's obviously free after you've jumped through a lot of hoops and you have to have at least one black creature in play.
Will that be the first removal spell in the regular cube that references Planeswalkers? Like, obviously, Oblivion Rings can hit Planeswalkers, but most of your creature removal doesn't hit Planeswalkers, so this will be the first one that actually mentions them?
There is one or two, and there are
Are you
two
on Blood Chief's
Planeswalkers.
Thirst?
Yes.
Okay,
yeah,
so that's one.
There are a couple. I did definitely give a bigger knock to cards that reference battles specifically.
Yeah, but we didn't talk about that detail. I am a little bummed by cards that mention battles specifically. Because I don't expect it to be a mechanic that's going to show up a lot in Magic moving forward. I think it's going to be a very sometimes mechanic, and
you say that now.
I hope. Anyway, that's kind of a bummer to me, but what you going to do? I'm a boomer.
I love to avoid extra text as much as possible, text that literally doesn't matter, but that's a fairly small concession. It's always just a balance of all of these things. The other 2 Convoke spells I've got here are Combat Tricks, which I'm even a little bit more skeptical of, but they might be worth just trying for some of the existing Combat Tricks. Aerial Boost, which is 1 and a white for an instant with Convoke. Target creature gets +2/+2 and gains flying. This, I think, similarly does allow you to sort of break up some board stalls and attack in some situations where you otherwise couldn't, so it could be interesting. And Burning Sun's Fury, which is 1 and a red for 2 target creatures, each get +2/+0 and haste until end of turn, which there is also a little bit of a heroic theme, so being able to target 2 creatures is pretty relevant. So
that one's kind of interesting to me.
A good swap for some existing cards. And also just the fact that it's giving haste is kind of a weird ability.
I love that. It's weird on Convoke because you're tapping creatures to do it.
But it might just mean, here's my early plays that don't matter anymore. I can, cast 2 drops and then use my other 2 creatures.
Well, the other way the early plays could matter is you could make their power bigger, which this also does.
Yeah, great point.
I think it's cool. We've talked about Combat Tricks a lot. They're not my favorite card type. I love ones that grant haste. I think haste is a really awesome mechanic to grant on a cheap spell because it totally changes the way you sequence, and you can just play to a state where you kind of get your opponent in a way that I think is really rewarding.
I also honestly really like tricks that only pump power, which maybe sounds weird, but I like that they either, if you're casting them first main phase, give your opponent a choice of, do you want to take that damage now that's going to be this temporary boost, or is it worth trading off? And it often doesn't just mean like, well, I couldn't have won this combat anyway because my opponent had this giant growth, so like what was the point of this? It does still, I think, offer or just comes with risk in a way that I think is meaningful and interesting.
If only Combat Tricks had risk.
Yeah, exactly. Then I've got a couple other cards which I may be slightly more skeptical of. Deeproot Wayfinder. This is 1 and a green for a 2/3. When it deals combat damage to a player, surveil 1. I love surveil.
Play or battle.
Or battle. See, I'm already just not reading it. Surveil 1, then you may return a land card from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. This is definitely a pushed card for this environment at a 2 mana 2/3 with a bunch of upside, but green is playing a more aggressive role here, so I think having some more signposts for that, even if this is a little bit of a power outlier, makes some sense. And then we've got some potentials for interactions with the land matter stuff, so I'm skeptical of this in terms of being a little bit overpowered, but I'm thinking about it.
It seems really strong here. Spoiler alert, I'm also considering testing in the Bun Magic Cube.
Okay.
I do think that it's going to scale a little bit just because I have so many fetch lands that even if you don't surveil into one, you will pretty much always have a land to get back if you hit with this thing, which is not going to be true in the regular cube. You have to really draft to prioritize the 8 Prismatic Vistas that are floating around.
10 now. And
the 10 Prismatic Vistas that are floating around. Or otherwise put lands in your graveyard with spells in order for that to be reliable. So I do think it's a little more of a build around, but just a 2-mana 2/3 is already a lot. And this is a 2-mana 3/3 with a really big upside if you get to start smacking and getting cards back.
For sure. Next up, Placid Rottentail, 1 green mana for a Fungus Rabbit. Gotta call it the creature type here because it's a Fungus Rabbit. It's a 1/1 with Vigilance, and it also has 2 and a green, exile it from your graveyard to put 2 counters on a target creature. Again, I feel like this is just a reasonable, aggressive threat for green decks. I definitely think I could afford to go up a little bit on some of the 1-drops that are, because I don't have a bunch of elves in this environment, it is more about just aggressive green, cheap creatures. So I think this is a reasonable guy. The last card I want to mention is Elspeth's Smite. This is 1 white for an instant, and it deals 3 damage to target attacking or blocking creature. If that creature would die this turn, exile it instead. I think this is just a very reasonable and efficient removal spell. There are definitely some white removal spells that people have just overlooked. Even if I think they're okay on power level, they're definitely not super appealing, so I think this will be a reasonable swap.
This one, I think, is very powerful. This is also in my Bun Magic Cube testing list. I don't run any removal right now that says target attacking or blocking creature. Correction, I do run Seat of Iganjo, the channel land, which does only deal damage to attacking or blocking creatures. Don't send me a tweet. Don't you dare send me a tweet. And the main reason why is that tends to be so much worse in aggressive decks because you essentially give them a free block, right? Like, they already played their thing to block your stuff. They still get to block it on its way out. It often means you get to save your creature, which is nice, but you're not pushing damage, which is what you really want to do with your removal spells. Like, I will so much more excitedly take an Unexpectedly Absent in my deck, even though they get the thing back, next turn if I just cast it for white or whatever. Just actually clearing that blocker and getting it for that damage is so important. But this is really, really efficient. And, in our cubes, 3 damage kills almost everything. So the fact that this, unlike a Path to Exile or whatever, doesn't give them a land back or something, I think makes it really compelling and very powerful.
Yeah, I mean, and the ceiling on 1-for-1 removal is fairly low in terms of, how much is it going to take over the game.
You could put Swords to Plowshares in your cube and it will be fine.
Right, so I feel like even though it is maybe pretty powerful, it's not something I worry about in the same way that a overpowered threat I would be worried about.
Yeah, the question of 1-for-1 removal really comes down to density of efficient versions.
Right.
If you have a bunch of efficient ones, then it's like, well, now I just can't really play 4-drops because I just get punished for playing 4-drops. But this one is going to miss your 4-mana 4/4s in green, so maybe a nice balance.
True. I just know I'm going to get, hit with this when somebody has Swiftblade Vindicator or some other big trampling creature, and I'm going to be sad. And that's what I got for the regular cube.
A lot. More than the normal set, I would say.
More than the normal set, which was surprising given I think the last couple sets I've been like, this set's really cool. It's got a lot of awesome mechanics, but not that many cards that actually feel like good fits. Here I've been like kind of down on battles and transforming double face cards, but there was just a bunch of stuff that seems pretty interesting.
I have a decent-sized list here for the Bun Magic Cube, but spoiler alert, I'm not actually that excited by any of them. Like, these are probably all going to be 5s or less on my survey, pretty much without fail. And I'll go roughly in order ascending of how likely I think they are to actually stick around in the cube. At the very bottom, we have Doomscar Warrior. This is 2 green for a creature human warrior. It's a 4/3 with backup 1 and trample. And whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player or battle, look at that many cards from the top of your library. You may reveal a creature or land card from among them, put it into your hand, put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So, it's a 4-mana, 4/3, or 5/3 with trample that essentially has kind of a curiosity effect, where you get to hit and draw cards if you don't whiff, and you could whiff if you hit a bunch of spells on top or something, but I think in most green decks, you're likely to hit a creature or land. That covers a lot of the card types in your deck. It's an interesting 4-drop, I think, and the backup is also a cool way to immediately recoup that card, right? So This is in that cool space between Muldrifter and Baneslayer, where if I just play it as a 5/4, it's fully Baneslayer. I got to untap and attack with it to get any value. But you can also just play with something else on board that can get in, or that can be made able to get in by the new +1/+1 counter, and then you get to hopefully get that card back immediately, which is really appealing.
Yeah, card seems pushed. It does a whole lot, and the floor is really, really high. I mean, obviously the floor is it eats a removal spell, which that's fine too.
I will also say I am right on the cusp of adding a Winota package to the Bun Magic Cube. This is a human, and this is a really cool human to hit off Winota, so that is part of my consideration of this card, and we'll see that reason come up again later. I also have Deep Root Wayfinder on here. If this didn't say battle on it, I would be that much more excited about it. I think I'm just going to have to get over that. I think it's a really powerful card, and in my cube, it's very often just going to get back a land every time it hits because there are so many fetch lands floating around. So that's appealing to me. I like it in like a Jund-style efficient deck where you're playing 2-drops that are threatening, or at least can, attack in through a variety of blockers, and then you're getting value other ways. Here's a more aspirational one that I think is just too cool to not mention. Thalia and the Gitrog monster. It's 1 white, black, green, so 1 and Abzan for a legendary creature, human frog, horror. It's a 4/4 with first strike and death touch. Just going to say first strike and death touch again, so it doesn't lose in combat almost ever.
First strike and death touch is a rough combination to see on the other side of the battlefield.
And 4 toughness is going to make it insulated from a lot of the removal in the Bud Magic Cube. It also says you may play an additional land on each of your turns. Creature and non-basic lands your opponents control enter the battlefield tapped. So that's the text on 3-mana Thalia, just reproduced here. And whenever Thalia and the Gitrog monster attacks, sacrifice a creature or land, then draw a card. That's not a may. You have to do it whenever that thing attacks. I imagine there'll be some times where you don't want to, but you have to do it.
You always want to do that because you can play additional cards. It's just going to draw you into more lands. The land you sacrifice maybe is a tapped land, so it maybe has some sequencing concerns, but that's all upside.
Yeah, I'm pretty excited to always sacrifice a land. Hard to imagine not being excited to do that. I do have a couple of 3-color cards in my cube when I think they're really cool and aspirational and worth going for. And this might get there. I think it's just really cool. Right now I have Anafenza in there, the 3-mana Abzan Anafenza, and I can see swapping that out for this just to try it out in those like grindy Abzan mid-rangey decks, because it does a lot. It's got a lot of text on it, and you can't really brawl with it. It's got first strike and death touch.
Yeah, that's a lot.
Then I have Kenra Spellspear. We talked about this one a little bit. The reason I'm not higher on this is it is still a double-face card, and that does mean it does have to clear a higher bar for me to be excited to include it. The backside is undoubtedly exciting. I mean, who doesn't get goosebumps when they see a card with prowess, right? Like, that's super exciting. The 4 mana to upgrade it, or 3 mana and 2 life, realistically almost always 3 mana and 2 life, that's not a huge barrier, but the fact that you can only do it as a sorcery definitely makes me skeptical of how powerful it's going to be in my cube, because they can, in response to you dumping 3 mana into this creature, just shock it. And then you're out all that mana you invested, and you don't get anything out of it. I'm less excited about this than, for example, Electrostatic Infantry, which I have in my cube and really like. I like the snowballing, like, Protect the Queen style gameplay that comes from cards like Sprite Dragon and Electrostatic Infantry, where you get to just play them early and then just play the rest of your game plan as you normally would, and this creature just keeps getting more and more threatening and closer to ending the game. And this just has regular prowess, so it plays more like the 1-drops in the spirit of Monastery Mentor or Soulscar Mage or something, which I think is not as compelling to me. Obviously, getting to flip it is great gravy. If you get to do that, I mean, that's pretty messed up. The Ward 2 on the backside is huge, and yeah, triple prowess is going to get them dead quick. So we'll see. I might come around on this one. This might be a third path Iconoclast situation where my initial impression is like, that's kind of pandering to me. I'm not going to be that excited about it, and then I'll eventually fall in love with it. But for right now, I'm in that you're kind of pandering to me stage.
Yeah, I wonder if this actually will play more like a 5-drop or, at least a modal spell that you're happy to play on 5 mana, because a 2 mana trample prowess creature for 2, I think is pretty underpowered for your environment.
I'm not sure it's that underpowered.
But if you can immediately, if your opponent's tapped out, you can cast and flip this. The Ward 2 is really going to mean that it's fairly likely to stick around, or at least tax your opponent's resources fairly heavily, and then you get to do that prowess turn.
I learned from Bloodthirsty Adversary that my cube is not interested in 5-drops in decks like that. The Bloodthirsty Adversary is the red 2-drop with kicker, 2 in a red, you get to flashback a spell, and that essentially never happened. You just never get to 5 in decks like that, and for that reason, that card was just not compelling to people. So I think if you're playing this, you're playing it on 2, because you're getting your creatures in play first, and then you're going to get value off all of your cantrips and all of your counter spells and all of your removal spells. You're playing it early, and you're hoping to get in for damage, and you will. I think a 2 mana 2/2 trample prowess that's good. I don't think it's that far underpowered. The question is just, is it exciting? Is it fun? I think it's more fun to look at something like an Electrostatic Infantry for me personally, because that like snowballing effect I think is really rewarding. That's where I'm at on it currently. There's kind of a gap here between the next 4 cards, which I am more excited about. The first one is Elspeth Smite. I am really excited about that card. I think it's really efficient and really powerful. I'm going to try it out, and I think it's totally okay to have some removal. It's just not as good in aggressive decks, because there's a variety of different removal spells, and you can prioritize them differently. Control decks are going to love this card. I mean, it's incredible. They attack you, poof, your thing's gone, 1 mana. You get nothing out of the deal. You get no land, you get no life. It's just going to take the thing away and get it gone. So really into it in control decks, really into it in mid-range decks, and I'll play it in aggro decks a lot of the time probably, but it's going to be a lot worse than a lot of the other options there.
For sure.
Then, a card that I'm cautiously very into, I think, but very cautiously. This is one I think is like, has the highest potential ceiling on where I could land on it, but I'm not like over the moon out of the gate, and that's Death Greeter's Champion. This is the first card from March of the Machine Commander. This is 2 and a red for a 2/1 creature human warrior. It's got dash for 3 and a red, so you can cast it for 3 and a red, and then it gets haste, and then pick it up at the end of the turn. It also has backup 1 and double strike. So, the modes on this card are, it's a 3 mana, 3/2 double strike.
That's kind of nuts. I feel like they are usually very, very cautious with double strike, and we'll see,
but it's in a commander product,
3
so
mana
who
1/2
cares?
with double strike or something like that. But there's a bunch of cards, I think in the main set as well as the commander set, that have double strike and are just like, yeah, I'm just 3 mana, 3/2 double strike. I hit for 6, no problem.
That's one mode, 3 mana, 3/2 double strike. Another mode is 4 mana, 3/2 double strike haste, and then pick it up again later on. And a 3/2 double strike haste is very scary. Your opponent could say like, well, they've only got one attacker, I'll swing in because I can take an attack from that thing back. And then you add 6 additional power for only 4 mana coming into them, which is pretty nuts. It's hard to block with 3 power and double strike. And then of course you have all the backup modes. So you can also play this as a 3 mana 2/1 double strike that also puts a +1/+1 counter on something and gives it double strike, which I think is one of the most powerful abilities you can temporarily grant to another creature. That's going to be really, really, really explosive, and I think really cool and powerful. And then, if you get to the late game, you can just dash this in every turn, not even attack with it if you don't have attacks with your 2/1 double strike, but just keep giving something else a +1/+1 counter and double strike until end of turn, which is going to get there eventually. That is a really powerful thing to do for 4 mana every turn in the late game.
For sure.
And it's a human that only costs 3 mana. You can hit it off Winota, you can hit it off Collective Company, you can get it back with Savin's Reclamation. It's in a sweet spot that is playing in a lot of the areas I've been trying to push in my cube. So I think on raw power level, it is not as good as the 3 drops I'm currently running, but I think the play patterns are more dynamic and interesting, and I could see myself cutting one to give this a shot.
Yeah, I mean, the modality here is really just kind of insane.
And the baseline is not bad. I mean, it's a 3 mana card that just dies to a shock, right? Which is what's going to happen a lot of the time, I think, if you play it for that baseline mode in my cube. But all the additional gravy of those upsides is really cool.
Yeah.
Like, I'd be so excited to play this in like a red-green deck where I was generating a bunch of extra mana, and dashing it every turn was pretty easy to do.
Yeah. Maybe I should be considering this for the Turbo Cube. We'll get to that.
2 more cards here. I don't know what to make of this card. Fairy Mastermind. 1 and a blue. This is the invitational card from the World Championship. Yuta Takahashi's invitational card. 1 and a blue for a creature fairy rogue. It is a 2/1 with flash and flying. And I gotta say, just right there, that's a pretty push card.
That's a card.
2 mana, 2 powered flyers are already kind of rare if you actually look through Magic's history. That's a really good amount of evasion on a 2-drop. We see them in white sometimes, and we get like a Femia or something in black, but I'm not sure blue's ever had that. That's pretty pushed. And then flash on top of that is just gravy, obviously. You can hold up counter magic and then flash this thing in. Then it also has the ability, whenever an opponent draws their second card each turn, you draw a card, and 3 and a blue, each opponent draws a card. In my cube, there's a lot of ways to draw additional cards. So I think the play pattern here is obviously your opponent goes to draw their second card for turn. In response to them casting a spell or activating the ability, it's going to cause that card draw. You flash this in, and you get a 2/1 flash flyer ETB draw card, which is a crazy rate. In the late game, too, you can also pay 3 and a blue, and it says each player draws a card. You do it on your opponent's turn, then you're going to effectively draw 2. So that's not actually symmetrical almost any of the time you're going to use it. I don't know how much that's going to come up. Certainly sometimes. I think this card is powerful. The thing, honestly, that has me most excited about it is I think I'm getting closer to being able to put Spellstutter Sprite in my cube and not have it be a sort of trap. I love Spellstutter Sprite. Like, I think it's already kind of playable just countering a lot of 1-drops, but as soon as you have, like, I have Vendilion Click, I have Fairy Mastermind, I have Brazen Bar, where, like, I'm getting to a little bit of a fairy density, Fairy Vandal. I'm getting to a fairy density where it's not inconceivable that you play a Spellstutter Sprite and counter a 2 or 3 mana spell, and that would be very exciting to me. So that's maybe the most exciting thing for me about this card. Otherwise, it just doesn't spark joy for me. It doesn't really, like, require you to build your deck in a specific way or even play in a specific way. It doesn't disrupt your opponent or offer you any disruptive decisions. I mean, I guess it kind of disrupts your opponent in that it punishes them for drawing extra cards on their turn, so that's something.
True.
But
Or you make them draw more cards, and that confuses their plan because they're not sure what to do anymore because they got extra cards.
Great equity, yeah.
Really disrupting.
Give them more options and just throw them off their game by hurting their brain. So yeah, I don't know. It feels like it's just a kind of a good stuff card to me, which doesn't have me like jumping for joy. But I'm definitely going to be testing it because it fits with a lot of the play patterns I am looking for in terms of like holding up counter magic, flashing in creatures in like a tempo-y deck.
I do like that you've got multiple different angles of tribal themes starting to sneak in here.
Yeah, it's getting weird.
Neat. I hate to tell you, but there are a lot of 2-mana 2/1 flyers in blue these days.
Really?
Even in just this set, we got a Skyclave Aerialist and also a Zephyr Winder just at common.
Well, wrong again, Mangold.
Power creep.
The last card I'm testing in the Blood Magic Cube is Wildfire Awakener. I've seen a lot of conversation about this card. This is another one from the March of the Machine Commander product. It's a little complicated to read out on air, but the mana cost for this is X1 red-white. So you always got to pay 1 red-white, 3 mana for this, and you can also pay X on top of that, any amount. It is a creature-human wizard. It's a 3/2 with Convoke. And when Wildfire Awakener enters the battlefield, you create X/1/1 red elemental creature tokens with, whenever this creature becomes tapped, it deals 1 damage to target player. So
you make a bunch of creatures, and then you cast a huge Wildfire Awakener, and then you attack with a bunch of little guys that all just ping your opponent right away, or are basically attacking for 2.
Yeah.
But what if you had 2 Wildfire Awakeners, and the second one you cast is way bigger because you have all those tokens from the last one, and then they also deal a bunch of damage because you're convoking with all your little dudes? This card really tells you a story about what you want to do with it.
Well, one of the things that people have been talking about is how good this card is with
White Mane Lion.
White Mane Lions.
Are you serious?
Yeah, absolutely.
Probably not actually White Mane
Mostly
Lion.
Core Skyfisher, but
yeah,
you know,
okay. Core Skyfisher.
But similar kinds of cards that allow you to do that thing. You know, you make a bunch of stuff, you put this back in your hand, then you can like just cast it for more and more and more, and just keep doing that as much as you can put it back in your hand.
And your opponent's going to be dead in a couple of those.
Not that long, yeah, just by convoking stuff. I am so thirsty for a red-white card that people see in a pack and gets them excited to draft red-white. And it's really hard to make that work at the power level that I'm playing. It's one of the like holes that I feel like has been in my cube for a long time. I don't know if this gets there, but on paper, it's pretty cool because you can either be a like mostly white creature-based deck, and then maybe you get to the point of the game where the board's stalled out, they've got some blockers for your attackers, you can't get in anymore. Then you just turn them all into mana, and you pay this for like X equals 3 or 4 or something, and now you have this much bigger board, and again, these 1/1s attack for 2 essentially, or just they attack and they tie up a blocker and deal 1 anyway, which is really powerful. It also works in all the red decks that are making tokens when you cast spells. Like, if you're mostly red and you're playing Young Pyromancers and stuff like that, and you're making a bunch of like little spell-slinging tokens, this can also then use all those tokens and turn them into something else, which I think is also really powerful. So I think it kind of works in a lot of different variations of red-white decks that all want to be playing small creatures, whether it's getting them via casting spells or just casting them as cards in your deck. And I'm optimistic about the power level. I think it could be very good.
Yeah, I mean, Convoke also just means sometimes this could just be a very cheap threat, and then it's also any other thing that lets you tap your creatures turns into an engine that you can just deal a bunch of damage to your opponent. So
yeah, you just use those things to crew your Smuggler's Copter.
All of you little guys,
everybody pile in the chopper.
Everybody get in the chopper.
Pile in the chopper. We're going to kill our opponent.
But it already has a get in there.
Get in there. Yeah, I think it could maybe get there. I'm not looking at it and saying like, wow, this is finally the card I've always wanted, but I think it could be. So that's my optimistic excitement. That's what I'm testing from this set. Like I said, none of these are super slam dunks, right? Like, I'm so much more excited for White Remand we're going to get in a couple months than I am for any of these cards. None of these are near a 10 for me, but there's some really interesting stuff here that I'm excited to try out.
Yeah, totally. If you want, we can talk a little bit about the Turbo Cube.
I mean, everyone wants that. Let's end on the
great.
Turbo Cube, because I should say I have nothing for the Degenerate Micro Cube.
That makes sense.
Didn't see anything
that's
that was getting there.
So the Turbo Cube is a totally super normal cube, except for one small twist, which is that all spells and activated abilities cost 2 generic mana less. This is my one cube that is somewhat power maxed, like I am just looking to play a lot of the most powerful cards, except for some exceptions of things that are just broken. So when I'm looking at a new set, it's often just like, let's find all the things that cost 2 generic and 1 color pip, or actually just 2
generic.
There are almost no actual colorless artifacts here, so I kind of wasn't expecting a lot, but I did find a couple things that are kind of interesting. Maybe the most obvious is that the Incubate tokens, because they cost 2 to activate, that's just free. So there's potentially a lot of stuff that creates Incubate tokens that can just create big threats. So simple one here, Phyrexian Awakening, 2 and a white, enters the battlefield, Incubate 4. and Phyrexians you control have Vigilance. So you take off that 2 from casting the enchantment.
1 white mana for...
1 white mana.
A 4/4.
4/4 with Vigilance.
Yeah.
And maybe even the extra permanent matters in some matchups.
Which, I gotta say, that's not a slam dunk, because you have the Mere Superior in here.
That's a little better.
Which is 0 mana for a 5/6, right?
That sounds right.
It's a 0 mana giant threat, and it is fine. There are some decks that can make use of it, but it's not like every deck is happy to have a 0 mana 5/6, because for a lot of decks, combat doesn't really matter.
That's really the thing, is I'm just not quite sure if this as a big body actually matters, but it is kind of interesting, so I might end up throwing it in there. Slightly more interesting, though, in the Incubate zone is Chrome Host Siege Shark.
The Incubate
zone.
This
is 2 and a blue for a Phyrexian Shark. It has flying. It's a 2/4.
What's up, Cribs? Welcome. This is my Incubate zone.
Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, Incubate X, where X is that spell's mana value. So if you cast this for 1 blue and then you start casting a bunch of very free artifacts, because the way that the cube is worded, you have this discount on spells, but it doesn't actually change the mana value of spells. Just like any, things like Helm of Awakening, it works in the same way. So you cast a bunch of your Guild Globes and things like that, you're just going to make a bunch of Incubate tokens, which you can then transform right away. There's also just lot of things that care about artifacts. So yeah, you might end up just saying, like, I just have Sciamaster Thopterus, and I'm just going to start sacrificing all these to draw cards.
Oh, but I mean, even just like the fact that you can transform for no mana at instant speed means you just do it at the last possible moment. And
right,
and you save yourself from any potential threats that can get rid of your creatures. I think the Shark is a slam dunk.
Slam dunk Shark.
Give it a 10 or maybe a 9. I don't know.
All right, so I think that the next one, leaving the Incubate zone, is also going to be a slam dunk, assuming that my goals for the cube stay sort of on the same course. This is Phyrexian Censor. This is 2 and a white for a 3/3 Phyrexian Wizard. Each player can't cast more than 1 non-Phyrexian creature each turn, and non-Phyrexian creatures enter the battlefield tapped. Currently, there is a little bit of a sort of hate bears package, things that are trying to shut down the really broken stuff that players are doing, and this is just another clean piece to add to that, I think.
I don't know how effective that's going to be.
Interesting.
Only hitting creature spells is a huge downgrade, because the decks that are casting...
No, it says each player can't cast more than 1 non-Phyrexian spell, which I believe means all spells.
Oh yeah, that's good then.
Okay, great.
That's real good.
Reading the card. In this case, I think it explains the card. That is a deck that, we don't play this cube a ton, so that's a deck that's still, not super proven. It's very deterministic.
It's very proven on the play.
On the play or the draw really makes a huge difference, which isn't my favorite feature of this environment, but, I think that if, again, I want to continue pushing that, this is a pretty clear tool for that theme. Land cycling is a pretty big feature of this environment as well. Basically, all those 2-mana plane cycling, island cycling, and so forth that we talked about. A bunch of them are in this cube, and they basically function as fetch lands with the modality of sometimes you do other stuff with them. I think the only one that I'm really interested in here is the Alabaster Host Intercessor, which has plane cycling, and basically as a Banisher Priest, exiles a creature your opponent controls.
That one only costs 4 mana to cast?
Costs 6, so it'll cost 4 in this environment. But that does, I have found myself casting
that will come up.
Chartooth Cougar, where I just, crack a bunch of eggs and don't have anything else to do with my mana because I kind of fizzled. This is actually a pretty relevant effect, so that'll likely be a swap. I don't think any of the others really stand out to me.
And the typed land cycling so much better here than the actual basic land cycling, because you very often have very few basics in your deck, and one of the very common play patterns in my experience is typed land cycling for a bicycle land.
Oh, yeah.
And then cycling that for free, and you just get to do stuff.
Yeah, or it just means that you can get all your dual lands with it as well. This next one I think is actually pretty cool. It's one of the backup cards. It says Voldaren Thrillseeker, 2 and a red for a 1/1 with backup 2. So at its floor, it's 1 mana for a 3/3 in this context. And it has pay 1 generic mana, sacrifice this creature. It deals damage equal to its power to any target. I'm less confident this is going to be a really powerful card here, but it has a lot of potential in that you can, if you have some big creature in play, you can just
like a Devilish Valet, for example.
Absolutely, a sacrifice outlet to be able to fling that at something. It deals damage to any target, so this could just function as basically 2 removal spells.
It's never gonna happen.
Okay.
It might happen sometimes.
Or you just fling a bunch of big stuff at your opponent's face, and that's kind of interesting to me.
Yeah, that one's interesting. It's something.
Okay. I'll take that. Next up, I've got Into the Fire. 2 and a red for a sorcery. Choose 1. Deals 2 damage to each creature, planeswalker, and battle. And put any number of cards from your hand on the bottom of your library, and then draw that many cards plus 1. This is kind of insane modality. I feel like currently the Wraths are a little bit underplayed. Pyroclasms also probably aren't as powerful because there are just like a lot of mere Superians and things running around. But it's still a relevant mode on top of what I think is the more powerful ability, which is just 1 red mana to basically mulligan your hand. But unlike a lot of these things, which will let you pitch and draw new cards,
replaces itself too.
It replaces itself. So I think that's just going to be a pretty potent card.
Yeah, that's only going to do unfair stuff, and I'm looking forward to it.
It's also, there are a lot of decks in this environment that are pretty combo-y and are looking for particular pieces, so that's going to be relevant.
It's also like you have to play enough lands that you have, your first 2,
that's
basically.
A great point, yeah.
But I find oftentimes if my deck can draw a lot of cards, I end up with plenty of extra lands in my hand by turn 3, which is the end of the game. So being able to recycle those all for new cards is going to be very appealing.
All right, and the last card here, I said no more Incubate, but I missed this one because I just thought of it as an aggressive red threat. This is Marauding Dreadship, 2 and a red for a 4/1 with haste. It's a vehicle. When it enters the battlefield, you incubate 2, and it has crew 2. So, easy play pattern here. You cast this for 1 red mana, you can immediately flip that incubate token, and it can crew it. So it's just a 1 red mana, 4/1 haste, and also, relevantly makes multiple artifacts, and yeah, seems like a lot of power here. Yeah. It's a boat.
Yeah, I'll try it out.
Okay.
I'll taste it.
And that's what I've got for the Turbo Cube. There definitely could be more things that are relevant here. I might want to take a closer look at some of those Incubate things. I definitely could take a second look at those land cycling cards. But, it's Cube.
The thing about the land cycling is you have so many options for those that you get to be picky because you don't want to put 30 in the cube. It just wouldn't make any sense.
Right.
That's all people would be doing, and it wouldn't be particularly interesting. So...
yeah, I think if anything, I already want to try and cut down a little bit on those.
Yeah,
based
and
on
and even as a deck builder, you don't want your 6th or 7th in your deck. I think is probably too many.
Yeah, it does. It's a weird environment because that does get tough. You don't want to be playing that many lands in your deck, but if you have a ton of land cycling, you also need a certain number of basics to make sure you have all your colors and things like that, or maybe not basics, at least like fetchable lands.
It is an effect with diminishing returns, and there's already a lot of options out there, so it's reasonable for you to just be picky for the ones you like. And that is the end of our March of the Machine Mechanics and Personal Cube Editions review. The community review is going to be a couple weeks off, so tune in next week for a regular episode of Anthony and I talking about cube design theory, or whatever we think of. And make sure you go to luckypaper.co and check the links in the banner for our surveys and fill them out with the new 1 to 10 rating system.
We should also maybe call out, because we talked about a lot of individual cards here. For every episode, we do have a page that actually shows the card images for every card in the order that we mentioned it. So if you want to follow along and be able to read the full text, just go to our website and go to the latest podcast episode and click on the link.
There's also a link in the show notes in whatever podcast app you're listening to.
It's right there. It's
to
on
the
your phone.
Cards mentioned.
Just look down, just scroll up, down, scroll a little bit.
Or press a button or something. Who knows what you're listening to this in. That's the beauty of podcasts. You could be listening to this in any way you want.
Out of your cat's mouth.
Most of you are listening on Spotify. You should stop. Go get a podcast app instead. That's a conversation for another time. And we don't have time for that. Instead, we have to wrap up this episode, so thanks for tuning in. All the music for this show is produced by DJ James Nasty. All the magic cards for this show are produced by Wizards of the Coast. This show is produced by Anthony and I, thinking really hard about magic cards. I've been speaking into microphones about it. I'm looking forward to pre-release, Anthony.
I'm always looking forward to pre-release, and we have beautiful spring weather here. I'm hoping I can pre-release outside.
Oh yeah, that is the dream. Looking forward to it.